was born in Camrose, Alberta, in July 29th, 1935. The family actually lived in Meeting Creek, Alberta, which is a few miles south of Camrose, but that's where the hospital was. My parents were farming. My mother had been adopted by a couple who had run the post office and the general store in Meeting Creek. When the war came along, I was only 4, my father volunteered and joined the Westminster Regiment and went overseas with them. My mother joined the Canadian Women's Army Corps. She actually ended up as the postmistress at the research establishment at Suffield, which is only 30 miles from Medicine Hat. So there's a bit of a Medicine Hat background there. My mother became a corporal, so she outranked my father. And my grandparents raised me during that period of time in Meeting Creek. But when Dad came back from overseas, invalided, and they returned him to work in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, we moved there. From grade 3 on, through the Moose Jaw public school system. The Alexandra School, named after Queen Alexandra, of course, and then Moose Jaw Central Collegiate Institute. When I graduated from high school, I wanted to go into law. I looked at going into law at the University of Saskatchewan, and one of their requirements was that you had to have grade 12 Latin, and I had given up the Latin in favor of, I forget what it was, another course. But UBC didn't require it, so I ended up at UBC. My family was, they weren't highly educated, but they were very insistent that I pursue a higher education. While I was there, I ran for and was a member of the Students' Union Council on my last 2 years, which is also political, obviously. On campus, there was a model parliament in which I was an active member of the Progressive Conservative Party. In the summertime, I went back to Moose Jaw, and there was a general election there in 1957 when Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservatives formed a minority government, and I was very much involved in the door knocking and what you do when you're a student working with a political entity. So I got involved there. That then carried on to campus at UBC. I enjoyed it. I went to Calgary to article with a law firm there. I was doing pretty well clerical work, and when my first cousin, Al Davis, started a veterinary practice here in Medicine Hat, he invited me to come down for the reception and so on. While I was there, a fairly young lawyer who had served in the military, and he said, "Oh, you're articling, are you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "How much are they paying you?" And I said, $300 a month. And he said, "Well, I'll pay you $350 if you'll transfer your articles down here to Medicine Hat and work with me and my firm." That was a fairly major incentive in those days. And furthermore, when I got here, rather than doing straight clerical work and so on, I got right into practicing law. I was in court, I think, the first week after I got here on minor things, but nonetheless, it gave me a chance to practice all kinds of different law, from drawing wills to estate work, some small criminal cases. Eventually, I ended up doing 2 murder trials in Medicine Hat, which actually the first one came about 10 years after I moved here, before there was a murder in Medicine Hat in those days. When I first came here, there weren't any apartments available for some time, so I lived with my cousin and his family. And their neighbor across the street was a teacher in Alexandra High School. Her name was Dorothy Jones. And socializing, she said, There was a major dance coming up in Medicine Hat, run by the Canet Club. They used to put those on about 6 or 7 a year, and they were quite large and lots of fun. Dorothy said to me, "There's a young school teacher I'd like you to meet. Maybe you could invite her to come to this dance with you." And her name was Betty Whitney. So I got her phone number and phoned her and introduced myself on the phone as being a friend with Dorothy and asked her to the dance. And the rest is history. When I first arrived here, there was a by-election underway because the sitting member had died, and I got involved in that campaign locally. I got involved in going to annual meetings of the Progressive Conservative Association of Alberta, and within 3 years I was the vice president for Southern Alberta. Interestingly enough, the vice president for Northern Alberta was Don Mazankowski. And he went on to become the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, of course. I became the Deputy Premier of Alberta. So the two of us had a good foundation there in politicking during those early years. The provincial Progressive Conservative Association was almost non-existent. Social credit ruled and had ruled since 1935 with big majorities wherever. But in many ways, they were a conservative type of government. As we were holding an executive committee meeting in Calgary to consider what to do with no leader and whether or not we could call a leadership convention and get anybody to run, there was a group of our executive gathered in my room. There was a quite large, loud, if I may say so, Calgary oilman, whose name's just slipped my memory right at the moment. He said, "There's a young man here who's interested in seeking the leadership of the party." Well, when that happened, our jaws dropped because we didn't have a seat in the legislature, no money, and that young man was Peter Lougheed. And he came into the room, and without any question, by the time he left, he had 8 or 9 ardent supporters to go forward to a leadership convention, support him in his efforts. And then in 1965, he became the leader of the party. In the subsequent election in 1967, he had worked very hard to attract candidates throughout Alberta. There were 65 seats in the legislature at the time, and I think by the time the election was called, we were able to nominate 46 or 49. We couldn't fill the full slate. And in Southern Alberta in particular, which was solid social credit, I mean, he asked at the last minute if I would put my name forward so we'd have a candidate in southeastern Alberta. So I did. In 1967, I ran, and I came second. When you run an election, you have to put up a deposit of $100, I think it was. And if you don't get at least half of the vote of the winning candidate, you lose your deposit. But if you get more than half, then you get it back. Well, I was the first non-SOCRED, social creditor, since 1940 to save their deposit. It was quite a boost to my ego, and of course, it attracted some attention by other people in the community, so we began to build our constituency organization by selling memberships and having some social activities. In the next 4 years, we continued to build on our membership, and I ran again and lost. By the time the following election came along, they'd added 4 more members by elections, defections, what have you. So Lougheed, going into the 71 election, had 10 elected people on his caucus, gone from nothing to 10. And then in that election, they won. I didn't. None of our candidates south of Calgary were elected in that election. I don't know, I was crazy, I guess. Well, I think the fact that I had started from nothing and had built up to the point where I had a pretty good run at it. As I sought the nomination again, this time I had opposition from within the party. There were two other people came along and asked for the nomination. I won it. It was quite a large nomination convention, actually, I think there were almost 1,000 people at it, which had gone from nothing, and so we built up. In '75, I got the nomination, as I say, and I won. And I beat Bill Weiss, who had beaten me the previous election, but I won by 130 votes. But that was enough. Lougheed formed the government. He did not appoint me to cabinet, but nonetheless, during my first term, I had some responsibilities. First of all, they made me the chairman of the Private Bills Committee. Mm-hmm. And the Private Bills Committee, bills sponsored by organizations within the province, it's not political at all. I'll give you an example. The Alberta Wheat Pool is incorporated by a private bill of the legislature. Really? And if they want any changes to their bylaws, they have to apply to the Private Bills Committee, which I chaired. And so it was a good experience for me in terms of learning the parliamentary procedure. In any event, Lougheed also asked me to chair the Irrigation Committee of the Government Caucus. Now, the Irrigation Committee in Southern Alberta has been an enormous advantage in terms of agriculture. But over the years, it had been established well back, decades before, but it had sort of fallen into disrepair. So this Irrigation Committee, which I chaired of government members, I think there were 7 of us on the committee, went around and inspected all the irrigation systems in Alberta, met with the boards of directors of each irrigation district, and then we made a recommendation to the government to upgrade the system. And in order to do so, the government allocated I think $100 million from the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund to the irrigation districts in southern Alberta. So that was a success story, I think it's fair to say. It was one of the first major commitments by the government from the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. When I won the second time, the Premier asked me to take on the responsibilities as Minister of Advanced Education and Manpower. And that had appealed to me, and of course because of I'd had some education, I guess, with a couple of university degrees, also my role with the college. And so I took on that responsibility. I visited every post-secondary institution in the province, colleges, universities, technical institutes, and met with their boards of governors, got to know the system very well. I was the minister responsible for, once again, tapping into the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, this time to create the Alberta Heritage Scholarship Fund with a basic foundation of $100 million. That was used throughout the whole system to upgrade, add on programs, buildings, what have you. And then in 1980, which was the 75th anniversary of Alberta, we instituted the 1980s Advanced Education Endowment Fund with a commitment of $80 million. And that was out there to be matched by other people interested in post-secondary education at all institutions. The idea being that during the decade of the 1980s, that $80 million would be matched by the private sector and municipalities and whatever. It was matched in 4 years. And so the subsequent minister added another $80 million. And before the end of the decade of the 80s, they'd added another $40 million. So 80, and 40 is 200 million, right? During the course of my role as Minister of Advanced Education and Manpower, I was a member of the Council of Ministers of Education for Canada, involving ministers from every province. This is I think, a very interesting development. It was completely unexpected. In Britain, Mrs. Thatcher formed a government, and they joined the European Union during the same period of time. One of the things that they proposed to do, having gone to Europe, is to eliminate the preferential tuition fee that had been granted to Commonwealth students in United Kingdom universities, and to replace that preferential tuition fee for European students moving into the UK. Well, that didn't sit well with Canada and with the ministers of education in Canada in particular. And so our colleagues designated Brian Smith, who was the Minister of Education for British Columbia, and myself, to go to Britain to lobby the British Parliament against that proposal to eliminate the preferential tuition fees for Canadian students. Just an interesting aside, we decided to fly directly from there, but directly from there meant going to New York and then flying to... And when we went to New York, we ended up flying to the United Kingdom on the Concorde. Wow, let me tell you, it was something else. It was so much faster, and it was really quite an experience. But the day that we arrived, the House of Commons committee had come forward with an analysis of the Trudeau request to patriate the British North America Act. And they had expressed real concern in that report. It was called the Kershaw Report, named after Sir Anthony Kershaw, who chaired the committee. And it was an all-party committee in the UK Parliament. Expressed real concern that the Trudeau proposal had ignored the interests of the provinces. And so our premiers, Lougheed in my case and Bennett in the British Columbia case, asked Brian and I to stay in London and to reverse our lobbying towards defeating, if we could, the Trudeau proposal. We appeared before innumerable committees and individual ministers' meetings and members of the House of Lords, but the story was about that the High Commission, the federal level, had been instructed not to allow provincial ministers to have access to the British parliamentarians. And furthermore, the story was that Mrs. Thatcher had agreed with Trudeau that provincial representatives would not be allowed to come forward and try and defeat his proposal at the British parliamentary level. During the 2 weeks we ended up there, we met with almost 200 parliamentarians, both members of the Lords and the House of Commons, and they were sympathetic to the provincial position. The British Parliament said no, unless there's adequate provincial participation, we're not prepared to accede to the request. At the same time, the Supreme Court of Canada decision on that same topic came forward, and the Supreme Court of Canada said that provincial participation was necessary in order to proceed. So it was quite an exciting time for relatively young, not terribly experienced ministers to be given that responsibility. So one of the meetings that we held was with Earl Grey, the current Earl Grey at the time. So I had tea with Earl Grey in the House of Lords. How about that? In the event, of course, it was necessary to assemble the first ministers in Ottawa in 81, and then in 82, the Constitution was ratified and signed into law by the Queen and so on. Oh, and then there was an election. Lougheed asked me to take on the Intergovernmental Affairs portfolio, which I held for 10 years. And then when Don Getty became Premier, he asked me to carry on in that same responsibility. And then that led to, so I had this constitutional thing for a long time. And it ended up, of course, with the defeat of the Charlottetown Accord. And after that, I had it. It was extremely stressful. I was on airplanes most of the time, it seemed to me, going from one conference to another. Peter Lougheed had set up a task force on international trade issues, and he asked me to chair that committee. It was interesting because Mr. Mulroney had been elected Prime Minister of Canada in, I think, 1984, and during that campaign, he had opposed the notion of a free trade agreement, which had been engendered by the fact that the federal government had set up the Macdonald Royal Commission to examine the issue. And Alberta had brought forward a proposal to have Canada enter into the free trade negotiations. And it was the first Ministers' Conference that Mr. Mulroney chaired as Prime Minister. But Lougheed and otherwise, in our relationships with other provincial governments, had received the full support of all 10 provinces to propose this. And during the Regina meeting, which included Valentine's Day, the press made fun of that, of course, love-in, to enter into this agreement, and Mulroney agreed. And that started the process by which negotiations started underway. But the next element of that negotiation was that each province wanted a role in the negotiating process. The federal government had appointed Simon Reisman as the chief negotiator on the free trade agreement. They'd started, but the provinces still had not achieved a definable role in the process. Don Getty took the proposal, which Alberta had helped to develop with other provinces, as to how each province would have a role to play working with Simon Reisman in the negotiating process, which was a major role to play. And the reason for that is that the provinces own, manage, and control the natural resources. So how can you possibly negotiate a comprehensive international trade agreement without the participation of the provinces? And so the negotiation thing took place. Alberta had its own representative who reported to my task force. So that negotiation went on until finally the deal was signed. If you look at the responsibilities I had, the constitutional issue, the international trade issues. Oh, by the way, the discussions that were taking place at the international level on trade negotiations had a series of conferences, which I attended on behalf of Alberta as part of the Canadian delegation under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, GATT, it was called at the time. So that was another element of activity, which a lot of things were happening. Yeah. Big things were happening. It was a time when I was pretty stressed. I was Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs. I was Attorney General and Government House Leader. I can tell you that it was a challenging time. So, all in all, I look back on it with a sense of accomplishment in certain fields. Obviously, It's a significant failure in the constitutional arena by reason of Meech Lake and Charlottetown, failing to, I think, correct the imbalance in the House of Commons between the House of Commons and the Senate. I think the Senate should be an elected body, but I lost that one. Unfortunately, the Senate representation from Alberta is minor compared to Quebec and Ontario. There's not much appetite for constitutional reform in Canada. And quite frankly, I think it's a shame that most people really don't understand the Constitution. And if you talk to the man on the street or the woman on the street about constitutional reform, their eyes glaze over because it's something that's not taught well, I don't think, within our educational system. That's a hard one because I would guess in terms of the impact that it's had on the lives, economy of Albertans and Canadians, that would be the role I played in the free trade negotiations with the United States. And then in representing our interests in the GATT negotiations, insofar as making sure that provincial interests were considered seriously by the federal negotiators and so on. I think, that's, in terms of things that really impact on the lives of the people. But being a parliamentarian and operating in the British parliamentary system is an extremely important aspect of how government relates to the people it serves. And I'll use that term, serves. The one thing that Lougheed always said, never use the word power. We are here to serve the people. When she was 21, the Queen said, "My life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." And that was repeated over and over again in the last week or so. Mm-hmm. And that was Lougheed's instruction throughout the whole, and that was how we were supposed to and did approach the responsibilities that the people had given to us. So I think it's important to reflect on that. And how the press relates your roles as legislators to the public is sometimes very problematic. And because of all my travels, I'll just use this as an example, I ran up a huge airline bill. If you're flying from Halifax to Edmonton and then to Medicine Hat, and the next week you're flying to Victoria to Halifax or whatever, it runs up bills. And unfortunately, the media always reported it as if it was income. And my last election campaign, I knocked on the door, and the guy came to it and said, "Oh yeah." I said, "I'd like to have your support again." He said, "No, I'm not giving you my support this time." And I said, "Why?" He said, "I'm tired of paying for your holidays." Give me a break, flying around the country, and it's a big country, up and down and into the north and back to every province on a regular basis, sitting in conference meetings. And the other thing is, you get to the airport, you get into a taxi, you go to the conference meeting, you stay in the hotel for a night or two, and then you get back in the cab and you go to the airport. Not much fun in that, I can tell you. But it's work. That's a challenge that you've been accepted, and I didn't complain about it, but I just did get under my skin a little bit when they called it going on holidays. I was extremely fortunate in being married to a wonderful wife, and fortunately a wife who was prepared to and did support me throughout the whole exercise. There are a couple of incidents where I learned a lesson right at the earlier time, is that if you're going to a foreign country, get briefed on some of their don't do's. In Japan in particular, I proposed a toast using an Inuit word. When I sat down, my interpreter said, "Oh, minister, don't ever use that term again in Japan." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, it's a dirty word." If it's possible for a Japanese guy across the table to look shocked about something, he looked shocked when I responded to his toast. If I said no, you'd think I was perfect, but that was not the case, obviously. I think perhaps I would have been more careful in dealing with my colleagues as to what I was trying to do on their behalves. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you think you know that they understand what you're embarking on when they don't. So I think it's important to bring them into your confidence and to know that you have their support. First of all, I brought out the Lougheed rule. Never use the word power, always the other serve. And secondly, be honest. Be honest with the people you're serving, and be honest with the people that you're working with. I can tell you one thing about my role as government House Leader. Every Monday morning, I would meet with the House leaders of the opposition parties. Mm-hmm. And I would outline the government's proposal as to what was going to happen during the course of the week of the legislative session. And they would, in return, give me some idea as to where they were going to raise issues and make amendments or take a real hard stance against what we were proposing. And so we had a working relationship, which while it was not antagonistic, I wouldn't use that word, but they were opposed. It was opposition, that's their rule. Mm-hmm. But we had respect for each other's positions. The one government, the opposition House Leader I'll mention specifically was Pam Barrett, who led the opposition House, and she was a feisty gal. And we became pretty good friends in a way, you know. And she would be very frank. She'd say, "Well, we're going to do this, this, and that, but you know, so and so is probably going to do that, and there's nothing I can do about it." So you know, things like that. I look back on them with rather fondness rather than discomfort, and then we could laugh a little bit about it too. Well, I don't think I'd ever could do it again under the circumstances that they're operating under now. It's my observation that social media has distorted the ability to communicate honestly and frankly with each other, and that it can be used to completely destroy people. It's kind of interesting because I walk my dog a lot, and I run into people who know me. Hardly a day goes by that somebody doesn't say, "Oh yeah, I remember you. I wish you were still there up in Edmonton." And I say, "What did I ever do to you to wish that on me?" And then I say, "I'd rather have my toenails pulled out," because it has changed, and I don't think changed for the better at all. If you look at what's happening now and as to how the way Parliament and the legislature works, I think it would have been very fortunate to have been able to turn that tide around. And I don't envy them the role they're playing now. Within every party's caucus, there's always never perfect agreement on every issue. And we had some pretty vigorous debates within our caucus and the cabinet. Nothing like what's been happening recently, I'm afraid to say.